Next, since it's baseball season, I'll say next at bat will be Dr. Neal Benowitz. Dr. Benowitz is with UCSF. And I'm sorry, my computer just went blank. Forgive me, I don't have your proper bio. Can you just take a couple minutes to tell us a little bit about yourself and then go ahead and dive into your presentation, Dr. Benowitz.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to speak to this group, which is doing incredibly important work. So I'm emeritus professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. I practice cardiology, but I'm also trained as a clinical pharmacologist and a medical toxicologist. I've been doing research on nicotine and tobacco for many, many years, stimulated by the fact that smoking is the most preventable cause of premature cardiovascular disease. So I've done a lot of work on nicotine and vaping and nicotine-related policy. So today I want to talk about a nicotine-related policy issue. I'm going to talk about something which does not exist as policy now, but has been proposed by the FDA to occur next year, which is a policy to reduce the nicotine content of cigarettes. And this could have a huge impact on the smoking cessation landscape, including what all of you do every day. So this is my conflict of interest. I do consult with companies that market or developing smoking cessation medications, and I have served as an expert witness in litigation against tobacco companies. So the first point I want to make is getting smokers to quit as soon as possible is essential for public health. This is a projection that was made back in 2000 of the effects of prevention versus treatment. So the solid yellow line are cumulative deaths in millions between the year 2000 and 2050. And the dashed line is what happens if you prevent smoking in kids, which actually we're doing a great job. The smoking rates in high school seniors are now 3%. But the dashed line on the bottom is what happens if you treat patients. And the reason why this is important is because people die when they're smoking relatively soon. So they die from heart attacks, sudden death, chronic lung disease. So a critical thing is to get people to quit smoking as soon as possible to advance public health. So if you look at sort of the quitting scene, these are surveys that have been published from 2000 to 2015. So 70% of smokers want to quit. 50% have made a quit rate attempt in the past year. Only 5 to 7% are successful a year later. So while smoking cessation is really important and what you do is critical, we're still making slow progress on advancing the health of current smokers. So the concept of nicotine reduction is something which could make this process of quitting for the population much, much faster. So for enhanced quitting, these are some of the things that have worked well. So one is denormalization of smoking, so constriction of social networks. This has worked especially well in kids, but this is true for adults as well. Traditional smoking cessation interventions, which is what you all do very well. And that's really key to any intervention. Tobacco harm reduction, where there's different views about this. I'm actually more supportive than others. But this is basically trying to get people to switch from combusted cigarette smoking, which is most harmful, to non-combusted nicotine delivery systems. With, they may want to sustain nicotine exposure, with much less harm. And the last one is tobacco product regulation. That's nicotine focused. That's what I want to talk about. So the combustible tobacco endgame is something which has been discussed for years. And this is really a strategy to eradicate or reduce the minimal levels of use and disease caused by combustible tobacco products. The beliefs are that the status quo is unacceptable and that reducing smoking substantially will require something new, bold, and fundamentally different. So let's talk about nicotine pharmacology and public policy. So this is a key concept. So the 10 million deaths annually, premature deaths in developed countries, is caused by addictive combusted tobacco use. So the main toxicants that kill people are the oxidants, the prothrombotic chemicals, the carcinogenic chemicals that are in tobacco smoke. Nicotine is in a way responsible for all of this, but not because nicotine is directly that harmful. It's not harmless, but it's because nicotine drives combusted tobacco use. So if you look at the harm is related to two things. It's the intrinsic risk of the product and how much you use it. And nicotine is why people use tobacco multiple times per day. Nicotine addiction cycle. You heard a little bit about this in some of the other talks. So a person smokes a cigarette, nicotine gets absorbed rapidly. It affects arousal, mood modulation, and pleasure. Throughout the day, tolerance develops to the cigarette. You see physical dependence, which means withdrawal symptoms, even between cigarettes. And then drug abstinence produces withdrawal symptoms that then trigger craving and your next cigarette. So regular smokers basically take in the same amount of nicotine day after day after day to optimize arousal and mood and pleasure. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time about this, but people are concerned about the safety of nicotine. And this is something I've been interested in for a long time. Let me just summarize really quickly. Nicotine definitely causes addiction, and that's its main harm. It has a probable role in cardiovascular disease if you have pre-existing disease. Although data from Sweden, where large percentage of the population uses snus, which is oral tobacco, that delivers just as much nicotine as cigarette smoking, does not accelerate atherosclerosis, but probably increases the risk of events once you have cardiovascular disease. Reproductive toxicity, we know nicotine can affect birth weight and has got effects on fetal maturation. There's concerns about impaired adolescent brain development. I can answer questions later. I would say it's possible. Nicotine activates an anti-inflammatory reflex in the body, so it could affect infectious disease risk, shown in animals, not in people. There's some theoretical relationships to cancer and likely no role in COPD. All right, so again, why cigarettes are so harmful is because they're highly addictive. Addiction means loss of control of drug use, and we said that 70% of smokers are daily smokers and rarely go through a day without smoking, and that's all nicotine driven. We talked about this. Okay, so the history of the nicotine reduction intervention. So it starts, this is David Kessler, who was head of the FDA. He was a pediatrician. And back in the early 90s, he started looking at tobacco company documents. And they found documents showing that the companies designed cigarettes to alter bodily function and to be addictive. And he decided that nicotine delivery devices like cigarettes are drugs based on the FDA definition of a drug, which is a product that is intended to affect the structure or function of the body. And he declared the intention of the FDA to regulate cigarettes as drug delivery devices for nicotine. Well, the FDA decision to do that was overturned by the courts. But then in 2009, the Family Smoking and Tobacco Control Act was passed, which then gave FDA the authority to regulate cigarettes. And they formed the Center for Tobacco Products, which is the branch of FDA that regulates cigarette products. So since 2009, we've been able to regulate tobacco products. And this has given the FDA the authority to promulgate tobacco product standards as appropriate to the protection of public health. And standards means what's in the tobacco or what the tobacco product delivers. It also gave specific authority to reduce nicotine yields of the product as long as it does not require total nicotine to be reduced to 0. In 2016, Scott Gottlieb, who was head of the FDA at that time, and Mitch Zeller, who was head of the Center for Tobacco Products, published a really critical paper in New England Journal of Medicine, which basically talked about a nicotine-focused framework for public health. And in this framework, they said there is a continuum of risk for tobacco products. So cigarettes, which are the most intrinsically harmful, the most addictive, are on one end. Nicotine medications, which are much less addictive and not very harmful at all, are on the bottom end. Smokeless tobacco is part way up. E-cigarettes are part way up. And so the thought was that if people could not quit smoking, let's at least drive them down the continuum of risk of nicotine products. And it would also be supportive of the availability of, say, e-cigarettes or other less harmful tobacco products. So this was the intent of the FDA. Now, this was the commitment of the FDA to this was changed a bit when vaping became such a problem with adolescents. But this concept is still relevant for nicotine reduction. So the argument of this paper was that smoking causes almost 500,000 deaths per year in the US. Like I say, the core problem is not nicotine itself, but combusted tobacco. The goal was to reduce the addictiveness of cigarettes, to focus on nicotine and support innovation for harm reduction, and to continue or to consider the continuum of risk of nicotine-containing products. So what about reducing nicotine content of cigarettes to make them less addictive? So I and Jack Henningfield, a colleague, back in 1994, published this paper called Establishing a Nicotine Threshold for Addiction. And this was based on documents from tobacco companies showing that they did research to determine how much nicotine was needed to sustain smoking. And they make sure in their manufacturing that every cigarette contains that amount of nicotine. Now, at first, our thought was kids we know start smoking not because they're addicted, but because their friends are smoking or they want to be cool or whatever. And then over time, they change from smoking for social reasons to smoking for pharmacologic reasons. But if you ask kids, are you going to become addicted? They would say no. So the idea of this would be basically to give kids the freedom to, if they want to experiment with tobacco, that's fine, but they would not be driven to addiction. Now, obviously, if you're an adult smoker and this occurred throughout the population, it would also affect you. And then we did some calculations to suggest a dose to establish addiction. And then we proposed a gradual reduction of the nicotine content of cigarettes over 10 to 15 years, which at that time, FDA did not have authority to do, but now they do have it. And here's a cartoon I use in my talks. Basically, there's a study that was done just interviewing adolescents when they started smoking and saying, do you think you're going to be a smoker 5 years from now? And almost all of them said no. But when I went back and talked to them 5 years later, a high percentage were addicted. So again, the rationale was to prevent children who experiment with smoking from becoming addicted later in life, and that addicted smokers, most of whom would like to quit, will move towards cessation. 1998, the American Medical Association committee examined this proposal, and they basically endorsed it fully, saying we think it's a great idea, we think FDA should do this. In 1998. Now, I want to make sure you understand what a reduced nicotine content cigarette is. This is an ad from a long time ago when companies could advertise yields of cigarettes and different cigarettes. And so this shows basically tar yields of cigarettes, but nicotine could be put on the same scale. And there were some cigarettes like Neal that were very low, and cigarettes like Camel and Marlboro that were very high. And so people thought that low yield cigarettes were these commercial cigarettes. Well, it turns out these cigarettes contain just as much nicotine as regular cigarettes, as high yield cigarettes. They're low yield because of faster burn time. So the smoke machine takes fewer puffs, more ventilation, so more air comes through, ventilated filters, and also people just take more puffs and deeper puffs. This is a copy of the smoking, or picture of the smoking machine, which determines the yields. And you can see that you put a cigarette in there and you burn them. You take a standard puff every 30 seconds till it burns down to the filter overwrap. But smokers take much bigger puffs and much more puffs. And so this machine is really inaccurate. And we and others have studied this and found out that people switch to low yield cigarettes take in just as much nicotine as regular cigarettes, the commercial ones, because they contain the nicotine. The reduced nicotine content cigarette would have 95% less nicotine content. So you could not possibly compensate. So, and this is just what I said about compensation. So the original proposal was to reduce nicotine availability in cigarettes over maybe 10 years or whatever. And then for people who couldn't quit smoking, provide clean nicotine alternatives. And then they could either continue that or quit smoking, but the harm would be markedly reduced. An important thing to keep in mind is that if you reduce nicotine in cigarettes, all other forms of combusted tobacco have to also have reductions. So roll your own tobacco, little cigars, pipe tobacco, it must all be uniform, because otherwise people will just switch to a different product that's got nicotine. So it's not just cigarettes. Every combusted tobacco product has to have a nicotine reduction. So let me just summarize really quickly the study. So a number of studies have been done since the year 2000. We did the first ones, but several others have been done. So one of the first studies that we published was with a small group of smokers switched to experimental cigarettes that were low in nicotine. And cotinine is a marker for daily nicotine intake. We did this over 6 weeks. And we found that people reduced their nicotine intake by 70%. They tolerated it pretty well. They did smoke a few other cigarettes that were not research cigarettes. We could tell it by analyzing the expected cotinine versus actual. Several quit after the end of the taper. And interestingly, at 8 and 10 weeks, when they were back on their normal products, their nicotine intake was substantially less than before. So the level of addiction had been decreased, and the amount of nicotine that they needed each day was decreased. This was the first study to look at this experimentally. And then this was cigarettes per day. So in the beginning, they smoked more cigarettes when the yields were a little bit higher, but by the time they got down to the lower yields, they were smoking fewer cigarettes. And as follow-up, back in their own cigarettes, they smoked half as many as a baseline. So clearly the level of addiction was reduced. And these are some quotes from some of my study participants. So I no longer feel the need to have coffee and cigarettes first thing in the morning. I'm experiencing less craving. Smoking these cigarettes are like quitting, and therefore I might as well quit. And smoking is losing its pleasure. So there have been several large studies. Eric Donnie did one that was published in New England Journal of Medicine in 2015. This was like 800 people using various yields, and basically working out what the threshold would be. And so they figured out that the level of nicotine would be 0.4 milligrams to 1.3 milligrams per cigarette. And they found that when you did that, people dropped their nicotine intake by 70%. They smoked fewer cigarettes per day. Those reduced dependence, increased quit attempts, no compensatory smoking, and no increase in other substances like cannabis or alcohol. Dorothy Hatsukami led another trial, which was published in JAMA in 2018, which looked at immediate versus gradual reduction. And basically what they found is that, first of all, immediate reduction was tolerated relatively well. You can see at the bottom, nicotine levels dropped markedly in immediate, more slowly with gradual, as you'd expect, versus own control cigarettes. And cigarettes per day and exposure to toxicants drop more if you immediately drop levels. So the current consensus is we don't need to taper over 5 or 10 years. We could do this immediately. So, as soon as FDA does it, and as soon as the lawsuits are settled in the court, they do it. And what was found in this study, basically, is that immediate reduction was associated with greater decreases in tobacco dependence and higher rates and duration of the number of days of abstinence that occurred. So this seems to be a pretty reasonable approach. Again, there's been concerns about compensation. Well, won't people just smoke more cigarettes? Because we know that occurs when they're switched to commercial low-yield cigarettes. As I mentioned before, with very low-yield nicotine cigarettes, compensation is impossible. And several clinical trials document no increased exposure, including studies that were done in hotel rooms where people could not get 1 or 2 of their own cigarettes if they needed it. And basically, over a week, people reduced their nicotine levels to 5% of baseline, and a number of biomarkers were examined. There was no increase in any toxicant exposure. So compensation is not an issue. So in 2018, the FDA issued an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking for a tobacco product standard for nicotine levels in combustible tobacco. And they elicited comments from a variety of sources. They analyzed those comments. And then this year, it was announced that the Biden administration is considering a rule that could be put in place by 2023 to cut the nicotine in cigarettes. And they're also talking about banning menthol. Now, whether this is going to occur in 2023 is unclear because most likely the tobacco industry will file many lawsuits. But if this happens, this will be a total game changer in terms of tobacco control. And again, here's another quote from, I forgot, New York Times maybe. So one thing which comes up is nicotine reduction prohibition? This has been a big concern by a lot of people. And we know prohibition has not worked for other drugs such as alcohol and cannabis. And smokers, this is really important. Smokers need to be educated that nicotine is per se is not being prohibited. But what's happening is that the harmful delivery system for nicotine is being not prohibited, but markedly less addictive. And so other less so harmful forms of nicotine will still be available. And this is important because some people don't want to give up nicotine, or some people self-medicate mental illness with nicotine, and they need to have an out. They need to have a way to go so that this is not seen as prohibition. So possible adjuncts to nicotine reduction are nicotine replacement medications, non-combustible tobacco products like smokeless tobacco products like oral nicotine pouches, electronic cigarettes. And one thing people have talked about is differential taxation, which I won't get into here. But I think this is important that people need to have it out. So this is not viewed as another prohibition approach. I published a paper along with Eric Donnie and Dorothy Hatsukami in 2016 saying that reduced nicotine content cigarettes and e-cigarettes are best used in combination to promote the cigarette endgame. Of course, e-cigarettes need to be the least harmful ones and the most effective ones, and they have to be kept away from kids. But I think that's feasible. And this could be the end of combustible cigarettes. So some things are needed. And this is where the impact on the smoking cessation infrastructure comes in. There's got to be public and medical education about why this is being done. Again, we're not reducing nicotine because nicotine is what causes cancer. We're reducing nicotine because nicotine is what makes you smoke 20 cigarettes a day. This would tremendously increase the demand for tobacco dependence treatment. So millions of smokers would need assistance in a relatively short period of time. We also need surveillance to assess changes in cigarette consumptions, make sure that there's not increases, to look at whether kids are smoking more or less, any other unexpected consequences. And again, we talked about the ready availability of alternative non-combusted nicotine products. So again, these are the key public educational messages which people like you will need to transmit. So nicotine is not being reduced because it is intrinsically harmful, but because it sustains cigarette addiction. Nicotine reduction will make it easier to quit smoking, and other less harmful forms of nicotine will be available. So you need to convey these messages to everybody. So in conclusion, I would say reducing the nicotine content of cigarettes is likely to reduce the addictiveness of cigarettes. The result would be preventing children from becoming addicted smokers and giving adult smokers who are currently smoking greater freedom to stop if they decide to quit. And again, immediate rather than gradual nicotine reduction is probably safest and most feasible. Electronic nicotine delivery systems would provide an attractive alternative to conventional cigarettes and would likely enhance public acceptance of a nicotine reduction policy and the possible long-term adverse effects of these products, including primary addiction, nicotine addiction in youth, remain a concern and obviously have to be addressed. So a couple of papers have tried to assess what the impact would be modeling this. And so one paper published in the CDC by Appleberg in 2018, basically they modeled the effects, and they concluded that considering 2016 to 2100, nicotine reduction would prevent 33 million youth and young adults from becoming regular smokers. And that 5 million smokers would quit within 1 year of implementation and 13 million within 5 years. Another simulation was done in 2004 by Tangs about this proposal. And they projected that the smoking prevalence is likely to decline to 5% after this occurs, with a resultant gain of 137 million quality adjusted life years over 50 years. And that policymakers would be hard pressed to identify another domestic public health intervention short of historical sanitation efforts that has offered this magnitude of benefit to the population. So to end up, New Zealand is currently proposing this smoke-free 2025 tobacco control policy. And this is one, the Maori have got a high prevalence of smoking, and they're very much involved in leadership and decision-making. They're going to increase health promotion and community involvement. They're going to increase stop smoking services. They're also talking about reducing the nicotine content of cigarettes. And they're also doing something which I think is a good idea too. That's something called a smoke-free generation, which basically says that anyone born after a certain age cannot buy cigarettes. So say they, if you would go back, say 18 years from now, whatever that is, you would say anyone born after that year cannot buy cigarettes anymore. And for vaping, they want to ensure that smoked tobacco products are more regulated and less available than vaping products, again, to promote harm reduction. My final slide is this one. This is something that just came out. So besides the AMA, 72 health organizations in the US are now supporting FDA mandated nicotine reduction. So this includes the American Heart Association, the American Lung Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics. As many organizations as you can think of are all supporting this. So let me stop at this point and then ask if anyone has any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Benowitz. We do have a couple of questions. Are babies born to fathers who are heavy smokers affected as much as a mother who is a heavy smoker?
That's a very good question. Certainly, if you're born to a mother who's a smoker, there are a number of epigenetic changes. So there's changes to your DNA that the baby lives with the rest of their lives. It's not clear if the father's a smoker, how much that occurs. And so I'm not, there may be some data about it. I'm not specifically aware. It's also hard to sort out the fact that if the father is smoking, there's also a home where smoking is occurring. And so there's a lot of other socioeconomic issues that affect the behavior of the child when they're born in a smoking household.
Mhm. Okay. Okay. Emily Bertram says, as I understand it, vaping also has serious health consequences due to the high heat involved. Can you
Right.
speak to that?
So certainly there is a wide spectrum of harm from smoking depending on the device. So the big mod devices, which have high temperatures, generate large amounts of what are called thermal degradation products. So you're basically breaking down propylene glycol and glycerin into toxic things like acetaldehyde, nicotine, and formaldehyde. And those are clearly more toxic. And also people use liquids that are low in nicotine, so they vape much more into the lungs. But if you take a product like Juul, and I'm not promoting Juul, I'm just using this as an example because they were the first one to basically put in heat controlling feedback devices into the device. So they control the heating temperature so that it doesn't get as hot. Breakdown products are much, much less. There's high nicotine in there, which is a mixed blessing. The positive side, it means you have to take in very little aerosol to get in the amount of nicotine to satisfy a smoker. And that's so a Juul or Juul-like device could be relatively safe because it does not generate high temperatures and gives you plenty of nicotine. Now, the downside, of course, is that it's got a nicotine salt base, which makes it easier to inhale. And so it's easier for kids to inhale nicotine and become addicted. So that's a downside of Juul and similar devices. So that requires basically education and access control for youth. But I think devices like Juul probably have relatively little harm compared to cigarette smoking. And again, it's comparative. I would never recommend anyone to start Juuling or whatever, anything, if they're not a smoker. But smoking is such a harmful product, thousands of chemicals that are harmful to the body. E-cigarettes have got many fewer. Been a number of biomarker studies looking at all the toxins we can measure in the urine. And if you switch to an e-cigarette with a low temperature, your exposure, it's hard to detect exposure to a toxic over baseline, where cigarettes got huge effects. So I would say temperature is important, but this is something FDA could regulate. They could say only devices with low temperatures are the ones that could be on the market.
Okay. There's a question, have any efforts been made to remove ammonia from nicotine?
Okay. The ammonia story is interesting. So that the ammonia story, ammonia is in cigarettes and it has effects on the flavor of the cigarette. It makes it, it affects the taste. It's ironic because at one time there was a concern that ammonia, because it increased the pH of the smoke, would have made the smoke contain more free base nicotine. And it was thought maybe to be more addictive. Now it's interesting, and just as some history for you. Natural tobacco, when you burn it, has got a relatively high pH, and nicotine is quite irritating because the free base is irritating. That's what hits the receptors. Fluke curing, which was developed in the late 1800s, basically results in more sugars and more acids being generated, so the pH drops. And so a cigarette of pH 5.5 smoke, it's got mostly protonated nicotine, so it's not nicotine base, and that's less irritating and easier to inhale. And a Juul basically has got the same pH as cigarette smoke. So ammonia, if anything, makes the cigarette harder to inhale. And so the original concerns about more free base being more addictive have not been borne out. So basically, the main thing for ammonia is like another flavoring. So that basically makes the cigarette more tasty and people like it more. But the whole concept of ammonia making cigarettes more addictive, I don't think that's true.
Okay. All righty. Dr. Friedman has put some information regarding an article in the chat box. Dr. Friedman, you want to speak to what that article is?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier about NAC, nicotyl
N-acetylcysteine.
N-acetylcysteine for marijuana craving, and there's a reference to it right here.
Yeah.
That was from last talk, but
Yeah.
And so I don't know if it was talked about last, but we're studying the combination of marijuana and THC. And one,
good.
you know, you talk about vaping. We did a study with adolescents looking at urine, nicotine, and THC exposure. And there's a very high concordance. So if you were a smoker, you had a 70% chance of using marijuana. And we know that vapors, there's a high concordance of vaping nicotine and vaping THC. We also know that the combined use of marijuana and cigarette smoking makes you more dependent on both. So it's hard to quit smoking and hard to quit marijuana. So dealing with the combination of both of these, I think is going to be a real challenge for all of you in smoking cessation field, because if they're still smoking marijuana, it's going to make it harder for them to quit their cigarette smoking. So that's something you need to think about.
We have an investigator at my university who's working on blunts, which is very heavily marketed to the African American community. That's marijuana inside cigarette wrappings for the most part, cigar type wrappings. Cigar wrappings, right? Yeah.
Okay.
There was a question on your background. Is that like Tahoe?
No, this, you know, if any of you know the San Francisco area, so there's Mount Tamalpais.
Yeah, beautiful.
This is a place I mountain bike, and there's a lake that I mountain bike past, and I always stop here for a few minutes to admire the lake and to have a snack.
That's beautiful. It is.
Yeah.
And
What's the name of the lake?
Places.
What's the name of the lake?
It's Alpine Lake.
Alpine. Oh yeah, it is really beautiful up there. Wow.
Alpine Lake.
Okay, well, thank you for that background.
Thank you so
Somebody
much. It's a great
asked
talk. Really nice.
Yes, wonderful. And thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and share with us this morning. We really do appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. Okay.
Sure. All right.
Enjoy the rest of the meeting.
Thank
Bye.
you.